Welcome to March and Women's History Month on Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. I'm Carol Ann Lloyd, and I am thrilled to be bringing you conversations with some amazing women who are talking about other amazing women as we remind ourselves that her story is part of our history. So sit back and enjoy. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. I am delighted to be here with a special guest. I'm going to ask to introduce herself and tell us about the book she has. It's come out recently, and we're going to just dive right in. But I'm going to ask her to introduce herself and her book to us.
Hello, everyone, thank you so much for having me. I am Dr. Jade Scott, and I have produced this book here, which is Captive Queen: The Decrypted History of Mary, Queen of Scots. And as you say, it's just come out in the States just recently, and it came out in the UK end of October. So a little bit about myself, I suppose, to kind of kick us off. Um, I am an expert in early modern women's correspondence. I've published quite widely on Mary Queen of Scots letters, looking at things like how we attribute authorship to women's letters and, thinking about the editorial process and the secretarial process to do with royal letters. I did my PhD at the University of Glasgow. I did it on another early modern woman, Lady Anne Percy, who became quite a strong and important supporter of Mary Queen of Scots. And then I've stayed in Glasgow. I've kind of flitted about in different places, but I've mostly been based at Glasgow ever since. And I'm an affiliate in Scottish history there at the moment. And I am currently working on a kind of broader project looking at Scottish women letter writers from 1420 to 1625. And I am also the secretary of the Scottish History Society, which aims to kind of get everyone involved from lots of different backgrounds with the sources of Scottish history and make them accessible to people. So I have a lot of things kind of going on, but I always come back to my early modern women and especially their letters.
Thank you so much for giving us that scope of who you are and what you're doing. I really appreciate that. But you mentioned at the end that you always come back to the early modern women and their letters. So, what makes that so interesting? That's sort of where you return, you wander, but you return to that. So, what is it about that?
The letters are the real kind of thing that I am absolutely fascinated by and could ramble on about for hours and hours. So feel free to interrupt me to kind of keep us going. But yeah, I'm fascinated by early modern correspondence and in particular women's use of correspondence. I think letters are a really unique source because they are the type of source that you can come to from so many different backgrounds. It doesn't matter if you're a kind of literature person or, a historian, a traditional historian, materiality, a gender specialist. You can bring all these different disciplines to this one particular type of source. And get so much from it. And that's actually what people have been doing for the past 20, 30 years or so, really bringing this amazing discipline of epistolary culture to light. Um, and I'm really fortunate that when I started doing my PhD and I looked at Lady Anne Percy's letters, that I was able to kind of stand on the shoulders of that scholarship that had gone before and really benefit from this kind of cross-disciplinary approach that letters benefit from. I also have to admit that there is something quite kind of thrilling, I think, about letters. And I'm sure we'll talk in more detail, Caroline, about how, we need to be really careful with letters and we shouldn't, try and read too many modern expectations into them. But nonetheless, I think when you see a letter from someone in the past, there feels like there's some kind of connection there. You feel like they are kind of reaching out from beyond and kind of touching us right up to the present day because it is something that we're familiar with. It's still something that we recognize. It's still a text type that we all know to some extent today. And so I think there is a real sense of connection with people in the past when you look at letters. And for women, I think that's really important because, of course, women have suffered, kind of historiographically with being overlooked or being kind of forced into these different roles, depending on where kind of gender ideals have sat at various points in time. And so I think when you have access to a documentary source that has this kind of physical connection to the person, there's something that's really valuable about that for women in particular. And I think that is really what keeps bringing me back. I'm really fortunate to have been able to work with some amazing letter collections, of course, Mary's, Lady Anne Percy's as well, and now the ones I'm working on more broadly. But it's that kind of human connection, I think, to the letter. And when you get a chance to go and see a letter, and you see a letter that maybe, someone signed in the past, whether that's a big, flourish signature like Mary Queen of Scots, or it's just someone making a mark, because they weren't able to write fully, perhaps. Regardless, when you see that and you can, you really feel the sense of touching the same thing that they've touched. And I know that's, true of lots of different sources, but I think with letters, because they are so familiar to us,
Yes.
just keeps drawing me back.
And they feel personal, at least with a signature. And we know, and we'll talk about Mary's, she had some secretaries. She didn't handwrite every bit, but there's still a sense of the person either dictating or physically writing this. And as you say, with women, it gives us a window we don't often have because they're left out of so many other documents. So
Absolutely.
Mary Queen of Scots and her letters are particularly valuable because there's a period of her life where that's really how we learn about her. There are some records of expenses and things like that, but in the letters, we really learn. So, can you tell us a little bit about Mary and why letters are so important and so valuable, and what sort of drew you to a project where you were going to just zoom in on Mary's letters?
Pointers are incredibly valuable, and they're quite a unique source because we have so many of them, and that is obviously really unusual when you're going back
Yes.
to the 16th century. Even for royals, she's up there in the really big collections. We know that there are thousands of letters that survive, either that she's sent out or that people have sent to her. And of course, they've ended up scattered all over the globe. So that, there's some in the States and there's loads here in the national collections in London and also in Scotland as well. And they have really kind of scattered all over the place because she's this kind of iconic historical figure that people are still fascinated by. So a lot of them have also actually ended up in private collections. Um, but yeah, it's a really unique source for someone of her period and someone particularly, 16th century Scotland to have such a huge archive available, regardless of where it's ended up, to have that archive available makes her quite unique. Um, but there are drawbacks, I suppose, to having such a huge correspondence. If you have thousands of letters from someone, you have issues of scale, so you're thinking about, well, how do you identify them, how do you group them, and all that kind of thing. And I find that quite fascinating. I enjoy doing all that kind of textual editing side of things. So that's something that, I really enjoy and you really benefit from with someone like Mary. But more generally, um, I came to appreciate Mary's letters actually during my own PhD. So as I say, like I did a PhD on Lady Anne Percy and her letters, and I only had about 25, 30 tops if you include copies. So it shows you the difference in scale between these types of collections. But when I was working on Lady Anne Percy, it was then that I kind of started to see, because Lady Anne Percy became a supporter of Mary and was part of this kind of transnational network around her, I started to see Mary in a kind of different light in the sense I started to see the different types of strategies that she was using with her correspondence and the networks that she was maintaining through her correspondence, particularly through the almost 20 years that she's a prisoner in England. Really started to delve into that um, from my kind of doctoral research. And then I was really fortunate I got to work on an excellent project led by a colleague at Glasgow, Dr. Alison Wiggins, looking at Mary's letters and trying to see, where they'd ended up and kind of develop a hand list of sorts, I suppose. And it was then again that I was able to take a little bit further and start to embed her, really specifically bring these kind of wider concerns and interests I had in epistolary culture and women's writing textual editing, and bring that all together in this one person. And it just so happens, of course, that the person to be this really fascinating and quite dramatic figure from history. So you get all of that kind of interest as well. Um, but Mary's letters are really, really important. As you say, she really relies on letters for that period as a
Right.
captive in England. She has her kind of physical are diminished over time at various points. They're quite curtailed and quite constrained. And she's allowed fewer and fewer physical visitors. So, she can't just, have a chat like she would like to do. She can't convey messages in that. She also finds it more and more difficult to even pass on a message, a spoken message to someone to then get out because everyone around her is being monitored and watched and followed. So it's really difficult for her to communicate. And she does really rely on her letters. And even letters end up being, under surveillance and get intercepted. And
Mm-hmm.
that's why so many of them have survived, actually, is because they are intercepted during her captivity. But at the same time, she's using letters, I kind of think, for kind of two key things. We see our letters as being really important, or I see our letters as being really important because they tell us about the political culture, the events that she is involved with, these schemes and these plots to, free herself. And then as we get closer and closer to her execution, plots that broaden out to perhaps threaten Elizabeth directly. So the letters are critical for that because they give us so much of the detail of, what's happening, who the people are, when things are happening, and things like that. But they're also incredibly important for telling us about her actual everyday life. So you mentioned the fact that, we have other sources like expenses and things like that, and they're really fascinating too. But when you look at Mary's letters, you get a real sense of her lived reality. Now, of course, it's coming through a lens, as everything is, because very often she has different agendas depending on who she's writing to and what's happening. And, if she wants something to be moved, she has different purposes. But she get a sense of how it was for her, how her actual experience played out, the mundanity of it, the fact that she's kind of constrained to do the same things over and over. But you also see her using that everyday experience to try and maintain her status as a queen and, really think about self-identity. And that changes as she goes over the 20 years from, thinking about possibly being freed. And then when she realizes she probably won't be freed, that changes. But she still has that aim of this is how I see myself, and I want that to be reflected in the reality around me. And her letters are really important for that. So they're fascinating both for the big kind of scale drama that we all think of when we think about someone like Mary Queen of Scots, but also the actual, how was it for her to be in this prison for so long?
Right. And the way she sees herself, she's trying to get other people to see her in that same way as a royal, and the way she presents herself in these letters do that. So I was thinking as we were getting ready and chatting back and forth, um, we don't really experience in our day. I mean, if the power goes out and we can't use our phones for a minute, we all get really panicky. But that sense of being so isolated that there was no means of communication other than letters, and she knew her letters were being monitored and intercepted. So that sense of isolation, I think we have to imagine because we don't share it. So, what can we learn today from the extraordinary importance of these letters to keep her part of a wider world?
Look, you're absolutely right. I think it's quite hard for us to wrap our heads around this idea of, not having this instant communication whenever you want. Um, and it's true, we do. We start to kind of get, itchy feet, itchy fingers when our phone is not with us, or if someone doesn't reply right away, we start thinking, oh, have I said something that's upset them and things like that, and we interrogate things because we're so immediate, as you say, and that's necessarily how it would have been experienced in the past. You could wait quite a long time for letters, of course, even regardless of someone like Mary, just the general postal networks were not formalized in the 16th century. So you didn't have, the post wasn't coming to the door at the same time every day, Monday to Saturday or whenever it might be. That wasn't the case. It was very kind of intermittent, and you would rely on bearers to carry letters, and royals had official bearers, who were paid to do that, to carry letters. But of course, as Mary's imprisonment deteriorates, she has less and less access to that, as we said. So you're relying on, different ways of kind of getting letters out as well. And sometimes people would have to just trust a letter to a stranger's hand. You could literally say, oh, so and so is traveling up to that place. They'll carry the letter for you to there, and then they'll pass it on to someone else, and it'll get there. And so, of course, letters went missing as well. So, I have lots of letters that don't arrive. And that's quite common in early modern correspondence, is to hear people complaining about, I've not had a reply from the letter that I wrote you the last week, or, so you see people writing letters on, the 17th, 18th, 19th, because they've thought of something else to say. And it's not like you say, you can't just text someone and go, here, here's my next thought. It's literally, I need to write another letter and send it out. So that is a really kind of interesting juxtaposition that we can sometimes find it difficult to wrap our heads around. But nonetheless, I think it's also really important that we also kind of think this would have been the equivalent of our, instant messaging,
Mhm.
WhatsApp, whatever it might be. This was their way of communicating both formally and informally, so letters had lots of different functions. It's not like just today, because we don't tend to write letters as often as we have done in the past. We tend to think of letters as being quite a formal document. It's either something someone's writing to you, your credit card bills come through and said, you owe us this, um, or it's something that's seen as quite intimate. It's something that you think, well, I'll make the extra special effort. I'll write a love letter to someone or something like that. Letters had lots of different functions in the past, and they had really kind of everyday, um, kind of informal functions as well as those more formal ones. So you would write asking and demanding for, payment of debts and things like that. You would also write asking for favors. You would write, or you could write, various degrees of intimate letters. We have lots of letters between husbands and wives, for example. Mothers and children, they can be quite, quite human letters as well. And you will also get letters saying things like, I need more wood for the fire. Can you bring it on this date? Really everyday things. So it's quite helpful to think of it as being both, both something that's quite unusual to us, but also familiar in the sense of that was the equivalent. People would wait for a letter. And people would also not wait because people got impatient, and they would write again, or they would write a really grumpy letter saying, "Now you've not written back to me, this is unacceptable." Part of them is because all of the different kind of social aspects of our communications today, people still had that with letters. So letters have slightly different functions. They have a broader range of function than we think of them today, but they also had these social and interpersonal functions embedded within them. And that's what makes them really, really fascinating, but also really valuable for anyone who's studying, the past, the early modern period in particular. But also can be something that can be easily overlooked. It's, if you're not conscious of the kind of contemporary cultures of letter writing, you can miss a lot of those kind of social functions of letters. And so that's something that I've kind of been working on for a while. And then again, it builds on scholarship that's been going on for decades now. Um, and that's what I think, when you do tease out those different functions, you get so much more from these documents rather than just reading it for, you know, the facts, as it were. We were looking for the facts, of course. We're not writing, you don't want to sensationalize things, but at the same time, you're missing something if you're not putting them in that period in which they were written.
I think that's a great point because just like we build our relationship through communication, whether it's a text or a message or an email or whatever, all of that is happening in a slightly maybe less formal way. Quick text wouldn't take the time of a letter, but still you're sharing things, asking for a favor, asking for wood to be delivered, all of that. Which brings me to the question of a very important relationship that Mary had, and that was with Elizabeth. So we have these two women who are each other's closest relations. They are both born Mary became queen as a little girl, as an infant, in fact. Elizabeth eventually became queen as an adult, but in these royal households and with the troubles as well as the benefits that came along with that. But what do their letters to and from each other tell us about that relationship? Because they wrote to each other quite a bit.
They did indeed. They did indeed. And sadly, but certainly from Mary's perspective, it becomes quite a one-sided correspondence as we go on. And as we get through her 20 years of imprisonment, Elizabeth starts to kind of pull back. But you're absolutely right. They were corresponding with each other for, right through Mary's kind of French upbringing and beyond as she becomes back to Scotland in 1561 as well, in particular. That's when it really ramps up their communication. And I think that is an absolutely fascinating aspect, and it's something that people are still drawn to today, is this connection between Mary and Elizabeth. For me, it was quite important, and I kind of hope I've tried to do this with the book and with my work more generally. It's important that we don't set them up in opposition to one another, which is what I think has happened,
Mhm.
traditionally. They get placed in opposition to one another, and one is seen as somehow better than the other, and Elizabeth tends to win out, or has tended to win out at least, in the sense of she has been seen as the one who is somehow more rational. She, was this very clever and apparently had this incredible education and was, this kind of cunning and well thought out type. That's the kind of traditional portrayal, and I put that very much in air quotes because these things are
Mhm.
always being challenged. Whereas Mary, on the other hand, kind of got a bit of a kind of rougher deal and was seen as being a bit more frivolous, a bit, less serious. This idea of her being ruled by her heart somehow, and letting her
Yes.
emotions take over. Um, and a lot of great work has been done to challenge that as we've kind of come to this point now. But I think it still does persist. I think there's still this sense of these two powerful women, they have to be in opposition. There can't be this sense of, think about how they might have in different ways supported each other at different times.
Mhm.
Or at the very least, if when they are in opposition, we somehow are not allowed to see that as, well, that's just a facet of being human. It's not necessarily just because it's Elizabeth and Mary and women have to be in opposition all the time. So it's important for me to kind of interrogate that relationship in light of, these kind of traditional portrayals. And the letters between Mary and Elizabeth are really kind of valuable for looking at that relationship. Um, because I think we have in the past, as I say, kind of seen Mary as being the kind of emotional one, and she's seen as the one who's very much kind of pushing this relationship with Elizabeth. She addresses her as her sister and friend and cousin, and uses all of these kind of terms of familial endearment and things like that. And people have said, look, she's really kind of pushing this relationship. But again, if we think about letters in terms of their context, there are rhetorical functions, there are rhetorical expectations, there are set phrases that people would use regardless of the relationship. And so you have to kind of look at the language and see where it might be that they're following standard conventions rather than trying to read into it, oh, see, Mary wants to be best friends with Elizabeth and Elizabeth's not interested. So you get a lot more out of that. You also can then see the emotion that Mary uses in her letters, and she does. Her letters do contain a lot of emotion. I would never doubt that for a second. They do. They can be really emotional. But what I think she does is she uses emotion in quite a strategic way. So in her letters to Elizabeth, which can often be quite emotive in terms of the language, she's seeking to persuade someone to do something for her. She has a purpose in writing. She's not just writing because she's desperate somehow to be Elizabeth's best friend. Elizabeth essentially holds the keys to her freedom for a long period of time. And Mary is trying to get something out of that. And so, if you want to bring someone round to your way of thinking, you want to either get them to sympathize with you, you want to play up your sorry state, you want to play up the things that you have in common, you want to say we're the same, we're part of the same group. It's those men around us that are the others. They're not, it's just you and I. So she's doing all this strategically. And I think that's what has sometimes been kind of missing from looking at Mary's letters to Elizabeth in the past. The other thing as well, of course, is that Mary's letters to Elizabeth are also incredibly useful for seeing evidence, which we see across lots of letters, but in particular with Elizabeth, seeing that evidence of her understanding herself as a queen first and foremost. So, again, we've kind of pushed that down beneath this idea of Mary just being desperate to get Elizabeth's affection. And she did want Elizabeth's affection, as I say, but for a purpose, to get her out of this captivity, to get her back to where she wanted to be. But we also see the letters, Mary's addressing Elizabeth right up to, the few weeks, few months before her execution in 1587. She's addressing her as, I am your sister queen. I am the same as you. I might have been in prison for 20 years now, near enough, and it might be at your pleasure that I have been held against my will, but nonetheless, we are the same. Our status is the same, and that I think is just so incredible about Mary that she sticks with that right to the very end. And that's where the letters are really, really amazing because they give us that evidence of Mary's fashioning of herself, of her own identity, regardless of how bad it gets. And it does get bad, of course, at various points. And I think that's where they really are just a fantastic source.
Right. And in some ways, when she's saying writing to her as a sister and seems to be petitioning friendship, at the same time, she's positioning herself as sort of it's the two of us against everybody else. We are
Yes.
both queens in our own right. And look around, we're the two of us. Sometimes I wonder too if that temptation or tendency, even to pit them against each other, is people just didn't think there was enough room in the world for two queens. One's bad enough. Let's not have two. So we
Yes.
see we see with Elizabeth that she's trying to accomplish things with Elizabeth. Who else are important correspondents of Mary's during especially these difficult times toward the end? But who are some of her other correspondents that we can get a sense again of her having such a great realization of who she is? I mean, she hangs on to that so beautifully, I think.
I agree. I think that is something that, people have said to me in the past, yeah, but in the end, she's unsuccessful. She doesn't get what she wants. She doesn't get out of prison, and she is executed in the end. And I think, what, yeah, that is true. But I think when she realizes, or she recognizes rather, that she's maybe not going to get out of this captivity, she is still successful in portraying herself the way she wants to be portrayed. And then that becomes a memorialization as well that I think she's very much engaged with towards the last few months of her life. She kind of changes the focus of, rather than being a living queen, it's how will I be remembered as a Catholic
Hmm.
queen?
Uh-huh.
And that is something that I think that's her success. That's what she does. That's what we need to recognize. That can be a success in its own right. Um, so yeah, I think that is absolutely the case. And one of the kind of correspondence that I'm fascinated by is actually her correspondence with the Spanish ambassador, Bernardino de Mendoza, um, because again, they've kind of been looked at kind of superficially as being letters that are all about the various plots. And of course, there is discussion of plots. Certainly towards the end of her life, Mendoza becomes quite a really interesting correspondent, I think, because she writes to Mendoza about the Babington plot, which of course is the final plot that ultimately leads to her being tried and then executed by the English authorities. And she writes to Mendoza about the Babington plot in slightly open fashion than we see her writing about it with other people. She's still guarded, of course, because she recognises that letters are going to be watched and intercepted. But she's a bit more open with him, and she kind of frames her involvement with the Babington plotters with Mendoza as being, thinking about them as all being men of the same faith and how she fits into that, and how having the responsibility of being this figurehead for um, Catholics in England and beyond is quite a daunting prospect. And in the end, she does kind of embrace that. But you see her with Mendoza saying, I'm a bit reluctant to say put my name to this. And it's not just because she recognizes the threat to herself. It is this sense of she's starting to reshape how she sees things long term in terms of being seen as a Catholic martyr. And I find that fascinating, the way she writes to him. And then obviously he's kicked out of England for his involvement in an earlier plot, the Throckmorton plot. Um, so he is someone who is positioned within these kind of really interesting networks of, people who are openly supporting Mary in the official diplomatic channels, but then also these kind of covert people who are acting, um, kind of under the radar at various points, although Walsingham tends to ferret them out, much to Mary's disappointment. So I find her letters to Mendoza really interesting. I also find her letters to her female supporters incredibly interesting. Um, so she has, lots of different supporters again, within England and Scotland and beyond. And I find the letters that she shares with her kind of noble female supporters incredibly insightful. And again, they kind of give us this sense of this kind of more human sense behind this historical figure, this iconic figure that has been forced to play all these different roles and different kind of portrayals over the years. And you see her when she writes to some of these women, or she kind of sends messages on to other women through other channels. So sometimes, like with Lady Anne Percy, we don't have their letters to one another surviving, though we know they wrote to one another because they mention other letters. I wrote to Mary here, I wrote to Anne here, but they also write to one another through men. So we have letters from various people to Mary saying, oh, my last letter was a means of Anne Percy, or my last letter was a means of and Lady Ferniehurst, or whoever it might be. And I find these kind of female networks incredibly interesting. And with Mary, I think that is a really kind of another avenue, another kind of aspect of her and this huge correspondence that we have that is ripe for kind of, teasing out more and more information. Because she's seen, of course, as much like Elizabeth in many ways, but she's seen as one of these kind of historic woman that has such a bright light of her own that you sometimes think, well, you're not going to be able to see any of the other women around her. But with Mary, there are women around her throughout her life, and we can kind of reconstruct them. It's not quite as easy as with Mary, but it's not the case that it's just one light and no one else can shine. She has these women around her, and the letters again really give us a way into that. So those are kind of two different aspects, I suppose, the kind of diplomatic friends and female networks.
Well, and the female networks are just fascinating, and seeing the important, essential role that they play, because we think of the plotting, we think of Babington, or we think of Throckmorton, and we think of Walsingham, and we think of these men, but actually, the women making it all happen underneath the surface are so interesting. So now you mentioned and the subtitle, the decrypted histories. So I want to ask about some of the ways that Mary attempted through codes and ciphers to hide her messages as she was sending out these letters. I once read a quote that she was quite candid in some cases because she was so convinced her codes were unbreakable. So I will ask, do you find that to be true? And tell me about her codes and how she relied on them and developed them and all of that.
I mean, this is another kind of just yet another strand of Mary's huge correspondence we could talk about for hours. And you're right, yeah, we have hundreds of letters that she encoded to different ways, different levels of encryption, as you say. Sometimes, people could encrypt letters just as simply as, disguising a name. So rather than saying, Mary, you would just have M, or you'd have, a symbol for the name, or you'd have a nickname even. So, might use a biblical name or things like that. And you disguise names in places like that. Or, as you say, you build it right up to having the whole text absolutely disguised behind these various codes of different levels of complexity. Um, you can have substitution codes, and then you can have codes that are so minutely complex it's literally just having a little extra point on a symbol, and that changes the whole meaning, and it can be incredibly complex. And in the National Archives in London, we have about 70, more than 70 different ciphers that are attributed to Mary. that were found when her papers were searched just before she's taken to Fotheringay for her trial and execution. Um, and you see the different levels, the different ways in which they're encoding different information. Um, we also are incredibly fortunate that, again, a lot of them have ended up in the National Archives because they have been intercepted at the time. But lots of her coded letters were intercepted by, English agents working for Cecil or working for Walsingham. And they're decoded at the time, or they've attempted to decode them at the time. So we have I find these incredibly fascinating, these letters. So there's letters, for example, that Mary sends, that Thomas Phillips, Walsingham's kind of star decryptor, he has written in minute lettering above the original kind of code, where you see him trying to work out what it is, phrase by phrase, letter by letter. And then you turn the page in the next folio, and the volume is a kind of more polished. He's written up, here's a draft of what I think it is. So you see this process, and I just find that incredible that we still have that. Codes, I suppose them were not unbreakable. Because so many of them have made it into the kind of state archives where they have managed to kind of crack the code. Now, they might not have gotten every single thing right, of course. They might have made mistakes. They might, we can't necessarily retrospectively think about how effective they were, but they have managed to crack it to the extent that they get the gist of the message, and they can then, do what they need to do. And that's exactly what happens with the Babington plot. When Mary writes back to Anthony Babington, and that coded letter is intercepted and it comes into Walsingham's agents, and they go, "Oh, look, this is evidence enough. She's involved. She's writing to these plotters." And Walsingham and Phillips go, "No, it's not quite enough. We need something more." And so they add in a little extra question on, "Tell me the name of the six gentlemen who will kill the Queen," meaning Elizabeth. And it's that phrase that really kind of then is used against her. Um, so they're not unbreakable. And I think at various points she recognises that there are lots, her letters are absolutely peppered with references to alphabets, which is, reference to the keys to the different codes. They're being changed all the time. She does make sure that they are changed regularly. They are always being updated. If anyone is if anyone's stopped or letters are intercepted, she gets messages from various supporters saying, "We need to stop using this code because so and so has been stopped." And so that one's put on pause and they use another one. And they all have different codes amongst each other. So, Mary didn't just have one code that she was using for everyone. There were different codes for depending on who you're writing to. And then they would then write on to someone, and that might be changed again into a different code. So there's layers and layers. And I think the fact that they go to such effort shows actually that, she is aware that this is not a foolproof system. This is a system that can be manipulated. And the stakes are incredibly high, and that's exactly what happens to her in the end. Um, so we do see her kind of adapting these codes and, you know, recognizing that things need to be kept constantly in motion so that it's harder for someone to pin things down and say, "That's her code, that's her code." Um, I also find it fascinating as well to think about how much direct involvement she had. We know that she was obviously, aware of the codes and she's telling people to use different codes, but she would have had her secretaries for the most part with her during her captivity, not always and not right at the end, who were the ones who actually, wrote it up. So when we see these letters, these, fascinating and exciting letters and code, we can't say that that's in her hand because we don't have any evidence for that. Of course, you don't have a signature because you're not going to go to the trouble of writing a letter and a code and then, "Oh, Mary, this is Mary's, here you go." Big stamp on that. So we don't have, physical evidence to tie that. So we have to assume that most likely they were being drawn up by her secretaries. And that is the evidence that kind of gets pulled out at the final trial. The secretaries admit that Mary would either draw up a letter or she would dictate to them what it was. it would then be translated into whatever language it was supposed to go into, and then it would finally be translated into the code. Now she's approving that at every level, at every stage.
Mhm.
She's there. She's saying, yes, okay, it can go, put it in the packet, seal it, send it, go. But the physical evidence isn't there. And that's what I think she really thought she could rely on.
Mhm.
So I think actually she kind of had this sense of, even if these codes are broken, which she was probably aware of, there was so much effort going into monitoring her that they probably would have broken them at some point. And of course, they then are broken. Even if they're broken, there's no physical evidence to tie that to me. And she has that plausible deniability to say, I never wrote that. My original letter that I wrote in a draft, or the message that I conveyed orally to Carl,
Mhm.
or now they've changed it. The final message has been changed. And that's what I think the real value of the code is. It's not the code itself, it's not the fact that you're hiding stuff. It's there's that layer of, murkiness that you can go, no, that's not what I said originally though. So someone has intercepted that, someone has mediated that. And of course, then they do that. The English authorities actually do that. They do
Mhm.
mediate one of the coded letters and use that against her. So I think that's what she was very clever about recognizing the value of the code for Mary is not hiding stuff, putting a layer between herself and the evidence.
Right. So there's so many layers. And it's so
Yes,
interesting because you're describing that. And I'm thinking, and yet people still say, oh, she led with her heart, as if she didn't have this incredibly well thought out system where she's being strategic all the time.
absolutely.
So I think, yeah, I think that gets overlooked how involved she was and how brilliant she was at distancing herself as much as she could um, from all that's going on and keeping track of it. I mean, she would have to know everything and all the players all the time. So this
100%.
led with her heart business. I just think, yes. Now, was there anything that was just a real surprise to you as you were researching this book that just, whoa, you didn't expect or surprised you?
I was most surprised when I was doing the book by the kind of relationship between her and her son James. Obviously, I was aware of, the actual circumstances of how things had gone, but what surprised me actually was how important 1584, 1585 was in terms of her and James. The reason for that, I think that, and it's the kind of thing that had just been kind of in my subconscious, I'd been there the whole time and I hadn't really thought about why, actually this is an incredibly significant moment. And when I was doing the research for the book and I was looking at, letters between Mary and James, of which we have very few, and they're, mostly from James to Mary, because Mary's letters to James were either intercepted or they were destroyed because, whilst he's a minor, the various regents in Scotland don't want him communicating with his mother. So we don't have a lot of her to him. We have most of it's him to her. Um, so the James letters I found really quite surprising for me personally because they really made me really consider how important he actually was to how things ended for Mary. So of course we've looked at people have looked at Mary and James's relationship and either said oh he's a monster because he didn't do more for his mother, or no, he's quite pragmatic, he's quite right, she was a nobody to him, and again it's always black and white. Um, but in 1584, 1585, there's negotiations for Mary to be returned to Scotland. And there are negotiations on both sides, and there's a genuine chance that she might get released and sent to Scotland to be able to rule jointly with James. And the English would have gone to great lengths to make sure that she was purely a figurehead, that she would not have been allowed actual power. But how practical that could have been, we can only but guess. But there were these negotiations, and Mary was, of course, threw herself behind it to say yes, absolutely. And then in the end, in 1585, James pulls back and says, "No, I don't need to do this." He's determined to rule independently because he's obviously had quite a tumultuous upbringing himself and is kidnapped at various points in his life. So he's determined to rule independently, and Mary's quite determined that if she returns to Scotland, she will not be referred to as the Queen Mother, which is what the Scots say they will call her. She will be the Queen.
Mm.
And of course, then James goes, well, no, I don't want to rule jointly. I want to be an independent king. And so in the end, he pulls out of that negotiation. And that, when I was doing the research and looking at the letters between James and Mary, that was what I found quite surprising because I'd been aware of that. I'd known about it, but I just hadn't thought about how critical that moment must have been for her. And of course, it's around about that time that we then see her. There's the Babington plot. There's these moves, I think, towards really thinking about how she's going to be memorialized, how she's going to be seen as a Catholic martyr, and I think it's a really critical moment. And that's what surprised me was going back to something that I thought I knew. I thought I'd made my mind. I thought it's not that big a deal. It's just one of the many things that happen, one of the
Right.
many disappointments for Mary. And I actually had to reconsider that, and I found that quite surprising.
That's really interesting, the timing of it.
Mhm.
And then her decisions in the next, just few months.
Yeah,
Her mindset seems to shift. So
yeah.
that's super interesting. Thank you. Thank you. All right. So I want you to just imagine we're going to play a little let's pretend that you could go back in time. You could be a time traveler and meet with Mary.
Yeah.
When would you like to visit her? And what maybe is one or two questions that you might like to ask? Just a couple of questions. But when would you like it to be?
Yes. I have been pondering this because that is a big one with Mary because you think there's so many key moments that you could go back and think, well, right, okay. At first I thought, well, would I go back to just before she gets married to Darnley, to Henry Stuart Lord Darnley? Would I maybe go then? And I was like, no, I'll be a bit later. In the end, I think I would go back to the spring of 1568. She is still in Scotland, but she's being held at Lochleven in Perthshire. So she's still a prisoner, but she's not fled Scotland yet. She's not quite become the captive queen that she does become in England. I would go back to early 1568, spring 1568. The reason for that is because I think that is such a huge moment. That is when she decides, obviously, that she's going to escape from Lochleven. She's going to break out. She's going to try and, meet her who she sees as her rebels in the field. She's going to stand and fight. She's going to claim her crown back. And I would like to speak to her then because I think I'd love to ask her all the big questions we all want to know, like, did you know about Darnley going to get knocked off? Okay, we all know you knew, but how much did you know? I'd love to ask her that. How much did you really know? I'd love to ask her in a slightly less kind of trivial way and quite a sad way. I'd love to ask her, how she felt about Bothwell, how it
Mhm.
actually was for her to go through the horror that he puts her through. I'd love to see how that felt for her, as a queen, again being forced into these things that, she made bad decisions, of course, but these are things that are made to happen to her. So I'd love to ask her about that. And I'd love to ask her, what do you think is going to happen when you leave Lochleven? Say you lose, obviously me coming from the future, you can't change time, but you could say, so what if you lose that battle? What if you lose that battle? What then? What are you gonna do? And I'd love to just maybe put that seed of doubt in our mind and go, oh yeah, what would I do if I lose that final battle? Where will I go? Will I stay in Scotland? Will I leave? Will I go to England? And of course, that's what her supporters are trying to say to her as well after she does lose the battle and
Mhm.
she does decide to come to England. Some of them are saying to her, like, maybe you shouldn't go to England, stay in Scotland, go to France, whatever it might be. And she makes a decision to come to England. But I would like to get her just before then, where a lot of the big drama of the Scottish reign has happened, and we could ask her about it, but we haven't quite got to she's a captive yet, a full captive that she becomes in England. That would be my time, I think, that I would want to. Um, as I say, coming from the future, we can't change the past. We'd have the Outlander effect of being the horror of not being able to do anything about it.
Mhm.
But nonetheless, I'd like to just ask her, where do you see this going? What happens if this goes wrong? And just see what she thinks.
That's a really good point. So, yes, did she consider what if it goes wrong
Mm.
and where would I go next? And That's great because you're right. That's a moment. I mean, there are many moments, but that's a really important moment where she had some options and she chose England, but what were the other options? And, because I've often wondered, why did you choose England? So
A lot of the people around her at that time as well were thinking the exact same thing. Like, why are we doing this? Like, why don't we stay in Scotland? And, she still had support in Scotland even after the defeat. She could have still stayed in Scotland, but she would have had to stay in Scotland, probably in the West, in Argyll with the Earl of Argyll and supporters there, where she
mhm,
would be quite secure. But it would have been another form of captivity, I think, for her. I think she would have seen that as a kind of fugitive experience. And
mm,
I think after escaping from Lochleven and having been held for almost a year, I think she just was just determined not to do that, not to be a queen on the run, just to stand
mhm.
and be a queen. And obviously that's not how things end up in England, but there was a chance that it could. And I think that was
Yes.
enough for her.
And I think she believed it could. So that's great. Well, this has been so great. I'm so excited to show this again. This is so wonderful. You must, if you don't already have it. So you've told us a little bit about what you're doing next. So tell us where we can find you, where we can follow you and keep up to date on everything that's going on.
I really need to get myself a website, Caroline. I do not have a website yet, and that's my goal. That's going to be the goal for 2025. So keep a lookout, folks. There will be a website.
Okay,
Eventually, there will be a website.
good,
But
good.
I am on the usual social medias. I'm on what used to be Twitter, although I'm not there very much now. I've kind of moved over to the blue sky. And I am on Instagram as well. You can just do a search for me and I should come up. Mostly I have to admit my Instagram is for my dogs and horses, but there's something to be said for that too.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, I'll have some links in the show notes as well as information about the book so you can get your hands on it if you don't already have it. Well, Dr. Jade Scott, thank you so much for joining us. This has been wonderful. And to look at Mary Queen of Scots, we think we know her, but there is so much more to know. And these letters are they're just like opening windows, I think, and we can just learn so much more. So thank you so much for your work and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been lovely to chat.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us and join us again soon. Thank you for joining us on this special Women's History edition of Royals, Rebels, and Romantics. Please take time to share with a friend, give us a rating, let us hear from you as we keep exploring all of the ways that history shows us what's possible. Thank you for listening.